Live. So I think we should go ahead and get started. Let's start out with any questions that you guys have about any of the material from the last couple of weeks since our last exam. Who has a question to get us started?
There is one objective that says relate the structure and function of respiratory surfaces and the respiratory organs in various types of animals.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had thin epithelium on there, but it wasn't really explained in the slides, and I couldn't find any notes that I took on that. So could you kind of explain like how the epithelium works?
Well, so any respiratory surface has to be thin in order for oxygen to diffuse across it or for CO2 to cross it the other way. So the epithelium, the layer of epithelium that gas exchange happens through has to be thin, and it also has to be moist. And also, let somebody else in here. Also, it helps if there's a lot of surface area. And so there are various ways that organisms have more surface area, and it depends on the organism. So fish have gills, and their gills have branches, and then each branch has lots of little feathers. A gill almost looks like a feather because it's got branches and lots of sub branches. Inside our lungs, we have alveoli, so we have the respiratory tree, and it branches and branches and branches down to the tiny little air sacs, the alveoli. In birds, they have the parabronchi, which are also highly branched structures. In grasshoppers and other insects, they have the tracheal system, which is a system of tubes that branches and gets close to the cells. So in all cases, there's a lot of surface area of that respiratory surface. That's the kind of things I'm looking for.
Okay. For the thin epithelium though, there was like it had sponges and the cnidarian.
Oh, okay, yeah. So some organisms have a simple body plan where they have a very thin body wall so that all of their cells are exposed to the environment directly or almost directly, so they can rely on diffusion. Diffusion can only work for short distances just because it's a slow process. So if all of the cells are close to the surface of the body, then they don't have to have a specialized respiratory system. So organisms like sponges, it's pronounced cnidaria, that C is silent. And so cnidarians include hydras, jellyfish, corals, animals like that. And then in earthworms, since they have a long, thin body, their skin serves as their respiratory surface, and they get their oxygen through their skin. Amphibians rely on some respiration through their skin, and they also have lungs that are not super highly branched. So they also use their skin. Who else has a question?
Could you touch? Oh, sorry.
Never mind.
You can do it first.
Danielle first, and then Carolyn. Danielle first.
Oh, okay. Could you go over how O2 and CO2 are carried in the blood and what variables influence their transport?
Sure. So oxygen is carried in the blood by attaching to hemoglobin. Okay. And then what variables affect how well oxygen binds to hemoglobin? What does that depend on?
Is it pH?
It depends on pH, And what else? So if the pH goes down because it gets more acidic, then oxygen does not bind as well. Also, the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin depends on the concentration. So let me, let's see, let me find a slide that shows this. I'll find this with the O2 graph. I see a nod.
Yes.
So notice that oxygen concentration, which we refer to as partial pressures of oxygen, matters. So the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the stronger the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, or the higher the oxygen saturation. So at high partial pressures of oxygen, the hemoglobin has a strong affinity for oxygen, and the oxygen is 100% saturated at partial pressures over 100, which is the situation you're going to have in the lungs. So the hemoglobin grabs onto the oxygen really strongly in the lungs. And it looks like I have one more person waiting to get in, so let me do that. And then in the tissues where there is a lower partial pressure of oxygen, like 40 millimeters mercury, then the hemoglobin is not holding on to the oxygen as strongly. So the hemoglobin lets go of oxygen, which is perfect because then the oxygen can diffuse out into the cells. So the variables that affect the hemoglobin's ability to attach to oxygen are the partial pressures of oxygen and the acidity. And so if we go to this graph that shows the hemoglobin dissociation at different pHs, again, on the x-axis, we have oxygen concentration, but you'll see that that curve is displaced downward if we have a lower pH. So if you're exercising and you're producing lactic acid, and if you have produced a lot of CO2 and the CO2 forms carbonic acid, there's going to be more acidity or a lower pH. And then the hemoglobin will let go of more oxygen than it would at a higher pH. So both oxygen and pH affect the ability of hemoglobin to attach to oxygen. And then carbon dioxide is partly just carried dissolved in the blood plasma, and about a quarter of it binds to the hemoglobin, but 70% of it is converted to bicarbonate ions, and the majority of that diffuses into the plasma. So the majority of the carbon dioxide in the blood is carried in the form of bicarbonate ions in blood plasma. So we had this series of slides here that shows this. This shows the carbonic acid, the carbon dioxide and water combining to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into bicarbonate, and the bicarbonate is the main form that carries the carbon dioxide in the blood. So hopefully that helped answer that question. Yes. Now,
Yes.
Carolyn
Yes,
had a
thank you.
question, I think, or somebody else had a question. Was it Carolyn?
Yeah, I was wondering if we could go over one of the synthesis parts on the objectives. In one where it's talking about eating a hamburger for lunch, how in depth do you want us to like trace the carbon atom, and like what are you looking for that, essentially, I guess?
I'm looking for all the details.
Okay.
So, like, if you have like the bun maybe has a carbohydrate, and so you would need to know that the starch in that bun starts getting broken down in the mouth by amylase, and then it gets carried through the esophagus down to the stomach. In the stomach, the amylase gets exposed to an acidic condition and denatures, so that enzyme stops working in the stomach. And then the carbohydrate goes on into the small intestines, and then there are more enzymes in the small intestines that finish the breakdown of that starch into sugar. Then the sugar diffuses into the bloodstream and gets carried, and you need to know like the pathway through the bloodstream, like it goes through, it gets picked up in capillaries in the villi, and those capillaries dump into venules and dump into a vein and eventually into the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava takes the blood into the right atrium. From there, it goes into the right ventricle. From there, it gets pumped into the lungs, goes through the pulmonary circuit, comes back through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium and then into the left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle gets pumped through the aorta. And the aorta branches into various arteries and kind of depends on where the muscle cell is, but eventually that blood will go into a capillary near the muscle cell, and that sugar that's been carried in the blood all the way through that circulatory pathway then will diffuse into the cell, and from there in the cytoplasm it will undergo glycolysis, and that'll produce pyruvate, and the pyruvate then goes into the mitochondrion where it gets oxidized, and then you get acetyl-CoA, and the acetyl-CoA goes into the mitochondria, or goes through the Krebs cycle, and that fully oxidizes that 2-carbon sugar and produces CO2. Then you should know that the CO2 will diffuse out of the mitochondria into the cytoplasm, into the interstitial fluid, and back into the bloodstream. And then what's the pathway of that CO2 as it gets carried? It's going to be converted into carbonic acid and then into bicarbonate ion, which will be carried in the bloodstream as this graph shows, or this graphic shows, and that'll go into a vein, into the vena cava, one of the vena cavae, and into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, from the right ventricle into the pulmonary vein and pulmonary artery, and into the lungs. From the lung capillary, that CO2 will diffuse into the alveolus. From the alveolus, it'll go into a bronchiole, into one of the bronchi, and then into the trachea, and up through the larynx and the pharynx, and out either the nose or the mouth or nose. So that's, like the whole pathway. I want to know all of that stuff. So we're kind of working on the carbon cycle. And so far we've started with the carbohydrate and done the digestion and done the circulatory system and gone into the cell, and we've done cellular respiration, and then we know the respiratory system, so we've gotten the carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere. And now what we're working on is CO2 going into the plant, going through photosynthesis, getting fixed into a sugar. And the only step of that we haven't done is the sugar getting incorporated into a carbohydrate and being transported by a plant. So that's like the next thing that we're going to do. And we'll finish the carbon cycle. And then we'll kind of go to the ecosystem level. So the idea is this course is going to kind of help you track energy and carbon and other molecules all through the various cycles. Okay, let's see. We got a chat happening. And so somebody asked, if we didn't get all that, are we going to post the recording? Yes, this is being recorded as we speak. And this will be posted, the recording will be posted. So yes, that'll happen. We see some thumbs up. All right, what other questions do you guys have? We'll go back to the big screen so I can see you guys. Ooh, we got more people trying to get in. Maybe not. All right. So I am going to, let's see, start my PowerPoint of the day. And then I will share that with you guys. So we've done the questions piece. And now I want to move into sort of this review question, which you guys actually asked me. And this is a little bit different. So this is, how does a CO2 molecule travel from a muscle cell in your toe to a chloroplast? And then I want you to add to this, like what happens inside the chloroplast. And so I'm going to put you guys into breakout rooms. And let's see. And I'm gonna ask you to answer this question. When you get into your breakout room, I want you to actually make a model on the whiteboard. So one person in the group is going to have to share a whiteboard, and you should all be able to write on that whiteboard. Actually, would you like me to show you a video about how that works? Okay, so I'm going to, now you should be seeing my browser, and I'm gonna, all right, so that's how you do it. Did that make sense to everybody, more or less? Okay, so more or less, you'll figure it out because you guys are good at technology. So I have a lot of confidence in you guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and put you guys into breakout rooms. You'll just automatically be put in, let's see, we got 31 people. So I think I'll make 10 breakout rooms. And you will be automatically assigned to a breakout room. And so I'm going to go ahead and open all the rooms, and then I will ask you guys to join your room. And then I will broadcast a message to tell you what your task is. Okay, so what questions do you guys have after doing this activity? I know I dropped in on a bunch of you and you asked some questions. There are like 2 or 3 rooms I didn't get into. So what I'm going to have you do, whoever saved the whiteboard, I would like you guys to email that to me, and then I can give you some feedback on your diagram. But it looked like what you had was pretty good. But after the meeting, you guys can, somebody can email it to me. All right. So, I guess I should have given you this information before. Hopefully you listed in order. By the way, do you have something blocking part of this screen? Is that better? Are you guys seeing my PowerPoint? Yes, okay. So hopefully you listed the blood vessels and the heart chambers and the respiratory system passageways and all the various transport mechanisms. I don't know if you guys included how CO2 gets converted into bicarbonate ions, but that would be good. And diffusion from cell to blood, etc. And then inside the once the CO2 gets into the air, then it has to go through the stoma to get into the leaf, and then it diffuses from the airspace in the leaf into the mesophyll cell and into a chloroplast. So hopefully you guys got most of that. And I will take a look at your diagrams and try to give you some feedback. All right, so the next thing we're going to move into this semester is nutrient acquisition and transport in plants. So now that we know that plants make their own food, we want to talk about how the food is transported once they make it and how they get what they need from the environment. So our learning objectives for this this lesson are to be able to identify the environmental sources of all of the resources plants need, to describe plant adaptations for acquiring resources, and to discuss trade-offs plants experience in acquiring resources. So, adaptations for acquiring resources. First of all, let's just think about this question. What resources do plants need to acquire from their environment? So why don't you send me your answer in a chat message? What resources do plants need to get from their environments? Getting lots of answers. Excellent. Lots of agreement on what you guys are saying. So, a lot of you said the following things. Plants need sunlight, which because they need energy to run photosynthesis. They need CO2, they need water, and they need small amounts of minerals, which we haven't really talked about yet. So next question is, from what part of the environment does the plant get each one of these things that it needs? So you can send me your answers in the chat as well. From where in the environment does the plant get all these things? Somebody said, what's the question? It's the question at the bottom of the screen. From what part of the environment is each resource acquired? Okay, most of you guys, or many of you guys have given me a message, and most of you are agreeing pretty well on this. So the water and the minerals the plant absorbs from below ground, typically, for a typical plant, it's going to absorb water and minerals through its roots below ground, and it's going to absorb sunlight from above and CO2 from the air above ground. And then notice that the materials that the plant gets from below ground are going to have to be transported through the plant and up to the leaves. So if the plant needs water to do photosynthesis, that has to be transported from the roots all the way up to the leaves where the photosynthesis happens. And minerals, the plant needs small amounts of minerals, and we'll talk about plant nutrition next week. But for example, in order to make chlorophyll, chlorophyll requires some iron, and it also requires some nitrogen. And so both of those are going to come up from the roots. They're going to be minerals that are absorbed from below ground. And so we've got this picture in your book that kind of illustrates how a plant gets the things that it needs. So you see down here in the roots, the water and the minerals are going to be absorbed, and they're going to be carried up through the plant to the leaves, where a lot of the water is just going to evaporate out through the stomata in a process that we call transpiration. But some of that water is going to be used in photosynthesis, and that is what generates the oxygen that's released. Meanwhile, CO2 is being absorbed from the air, and the water and the CO2 together are going to be used to make sugar. The sugar then is going to be transported back down to the roots where it may be stored. And in the spring right now, actually, there's a lot of sugar stored down here in the roots, and it's actually going upwards in the plant, and it's being used to make new leaves. And then, of course, we have the light. So I want to show you a little video that I took. Let's see. I'm going to show you a video that I took just outside. So I'm going to drag this over here again, and we're going to look at my drive. And maybe it's going to load. So I took this video. We'll do this. Are you guys seeing this video now? Or at least?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, we're going to full screen it. So this is a video. This is a pine tree in front of my house. See, it's a pretty decent sized tree. And I want to show you what's going on with this pine tree. You can see as we get close here, there are some little holes. They're kind of in a pattern, and this side they're not too bad. But as we move around to this side of the tree, you will see just a ton of these holes. And these holes have been made by sap-sucking birds. We saw a yellow-bellied sapsucker on the tree, a couple of weeks ago, and you can see that it's kind of wet because the tree is losing its sap. Go up here, maybe to see more of these. These holes in the tree. It's just under attack. And so it has exuded this sap. You can see it's kind of drippy up there because it's also producing some protective stuff, so it's a little bit sticky. And if I touch it, it's wet, and it's sticky. It's sticky in my hands. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint here. So the plant is making sugar in its leaves. In the case of the pine tree, the leaves are the needles. And they have chloroplast, just like the chloroplast in a broadleaf of a deciduous tree. And that sugar is being transported in the phloem of the plant down to the roots. Or since it's springtime, there's probably a lot of upward movement of the sap. And the sapsuckers are drilling holes so that they can get at that sugar, and that's their food. The water that comes up from the roots travels in the xylem. So water always moves upward in the xylem versus sugars can move either up or down in the phloem. And those are the two vascular tissues that you probably read about in your homework. And let's see, maybe I could just draw those for us. Maybe. So I will just use a pen. So over here, the water is moving through the xylem. And the sugar is moving through the phloem. I hope you guys can read cursive because it's easier for me to write cursive with a mouse than it is to try to print it. So xylem is what water moves through, and phloem is what what sugar moves through, and see if I can get back to my, I don't know how to get back. Oh, not what I wanted to do. Pointer back to arrow automatic. Okay, there we go. Oops, okay. So now let's think about some adaptations that enable plants to acquire each of these resources. So in your chat now, write down what kind of adaptations plants have to acquire sunlight, to acquire CO2, to get water, to get minerals. What are some specific structures that plants have that help them acquire these resources? And so somebody's asking about how CO2, so CO2 is going to get absorbed through, well, I'm gonna let you guys answer this and then I'll try to answer that question. Okay, so in case you don't know what I'm looking for, one person put larger leaves. So a big leaf would give the plant the ability to capture a lot of sunlight. Okay, good. I'm getting lots of good answers here. So lots of people are saying large leaves to capture sunlight. I haven't seen very many people talk about CO2. Okay, there's one that just came in, stomata, which are pores in the leaves to allow the CO2 to come in. Water, a lot of people are talking about lots of branches of their roots, and minerals would be absorbed the same way. And so we'll talk about a couple of specific adaptations in a minute or two. Now, the plant also experiences some trade-offs. And what we mean by that is it has to compromise between getting more of something, but that might cause it to lose something else. So let me give you an example of this. One big trade-off for plants is capturing sunlight versus losing water. So as we said, it helps to have a big broad leaf to capture sunlight, but if you have a big broad leaf, you also have lots of surface area that water can evaporate off of. So you have to balance your need for getting sunlight with a big leaf versus losing water. And if we talk about the pine tree again, they have very small, thin leaves with not very much surface area. And so they are going to minimize losing water. And the trade-off is that they can't capture as much sunlight. So if you live in a dry place, you might be more adapted to conserve your water instead of getting sunlight. So that's one trade-off. One solution that plants have is that they do have a waxy waterproof covering on their leaves that helps them reduce the amount of water that they lose. But then if you have a waterproof covering, that means it's also hard to get carbon dioxide. So they have to have stomata. So another trade-off is they have to open their stomates so that they can bring in CO2. But when they do that, they're also going to lose water out those same stomates. So their solution is, if they're starting to lose a lot of water, then they're going to close their stomates. They're going to be able to control whether the stomates, the stomata, are open or closed. And then a third trade-off, one more solution to that is that most plants have a higher percentage of their stomata on the underside of their leaf as opposed to the upper side. And so this is beneficial because the sun is shining on the top, right? And so it's going to be warmer and probably drier on the top. So if you have your stomata on the bottom, you're not going to lose as much water when you open up your stomates because it's a little bit shaded. It's not as warm. It's not going to be quite as dry on the bottom of the leaf. And then third trade-off is that plants can either put energy towards growing tall, or they can put energy toward branching. And if you think about different kinds of trees that you know, they have kind of a different balance, a different compromise between growing tall and branching. So some trees are gonna opt for growing really, really tall, and the advantage of that is it gets you above your neighbors so that your neighbors aren't going to shade you. But if you're not branching, you're not like spreading out your branches as much as you could to get like more light. So some plants are going to branch instead of putting their energy towards growing tall, and then they're going to be able to kind of cover all like more area that they can absorb water from. So these are kind of some of the trade-offs or some of the compromises that plants have to deal with. So let's do a multiple choice question. And since I wasn't able to make the polling work last time, let's just do this in the chat. So send your answer in the chat. Plant adaptations represent compromises between enhancing what while minimizing what? Okay. I'll give you about 10 more seconds to put in your answer, A, B, C, or D. Make sure you put in an answer so I know that you're engaged. Alrighty, so most of you said D, which is the correct answer. Plants want to maximize photosynthesis while minimizing water loss. At least one person put A, but this is kind of backwards. They want to minimize water loss while maximizing carbon dioxide uptake. So that one's backwards. There were a couple people that put B, water absorption versus CO2 uptake. And this is kind of backwards also. Well, they kind of want both of these things. They need CO2, so this is not actually a trade-off. And remember that water gets absorbed from the roots. So if they are bringing in lots of CO2, that means that all those pathways are going to be open and more water is going to be absorbed. So the best answer is D. They want to maximize photosynthesis while minimizing water loss. Okay, so let's talk about some special adaptations of roots that enhance nutrient absorption. And some of you guys talked about this in your answers to me. So one is making lots of branches. And plants don't always make lots of branches with their roots. So for example, they might be sending down a root, and if there aren't very many nutrients in that soil, then the plant may not use the energy to go ahead and make branch roots in that area because it somehow senses that it's not going to be able to get much out of that soil. So instead, it'll just keep sending its root longer. But if it senses that there's a lot of nutrients in that area, especially if it's high in nitrogen, then it'll make a lot of branches in that area so that it can fully exploit that high resource area. So branching. Another one we learned about last week, I think, when you learned about the different parts of plants, and that is that the very tips of roots, the young roots, will develop root hairs. And these root hairs greatly increase the surface area for absorption of the root. And so the tips of the roots, which is where most of the absorption happens, they're going to have a lot of root hairs. And then the third thing is that many plants, probably most plants, have a mutualistic relationship with specialized fungi that increase the surface area for absorption. And these fungi are called mycorrhizae. The prefix of this word myco means fungus, and the rhiz part means root. So this literally means fungus root. And we will learn more about these fungi in about a week. And these fungi actually kind of penetrate into the tissues of the root. And it's mutualistic because the plant provides sugar for the fungus, but then the fungus also like extends its filaments, its hyphae into the soil, and that greatly increases the surface area that the plant has for absorbing nutrients. So all of these adaptations help the plant absorb nutrients. So let's do another multiple choice question in your chat. A root tip that's encountering a patch of soil that's rich in nitrogen is most likely to do what? Okay, I'll give you about 10 seconds. Okay, I would say that the majority of you guys chose C, which I think is the best answer, that the plant will form lateral branches of its roots there. It's not necessarily going to increase production of root hairs because it's always going to have root hairs in the tips of the root. But it's not always going to be forming lateral branches. It won't stop growing. It will grow more branches, and it will also just continue to grow deep, and it won't necessarily grow faster, but it'll form more branches. That, I think, is the best answer to this question. All right. Now, we talked about two main transport systems. And so just to get these in your notes, the xylem, which I mentioned before, is what transports water and minerals from the roots to the shoots. So this is a one-way flow upwards. And then the phloem transports sugar water both up and down between shoots and roots. And these two transport mechanisms there are two different mechanisms that we will get into on Friday. But for now, I just want you to know what gets transported. Now, somebody asked me whether carbon dioxide gets transported in the phloem, and it doesn't. There might be some CO2 dissolved in the phloem solution, but the CO2 is going to go into the leaf, and in the leaf, it's going to be used in photosynthesis to make sugar. So then it's the sugar that gets transported in the phloem. And that was what, that's why the sapsuckers are making holes in my pine tree so that they can get at that sugary water. And when we tap maple trees, we're getting at that sugary water that is in the phloem. And not only in the phloem, it actually, when you tap a maple tree, you tap all the way into the xylem. So you're also getting a lot of fluid from the water. Okay, so that's all we're gonna cover today. And this stuff that we covered today will also be testable on your test. So I will add our learning objectives for today. I'll go back up here. These learning objectives will be 3 others that we'll add, and those will be included on your exam. And I think what I will do, I'm not going to be available either Monday night or Tuesday night for a review session, but what I will do is I will have like an open review session, say from 9 to 11 on Wednesday morning, and then your exam opens at 11. Does that sound good to you guys? Okay, so I'll post like a, well, maybe I'll just set it up as a Zoom because Zoom seems to work pretty well. And so I'll just set that up for 9 to 11. I'll write it down so I don't forget. 9 to 11 review on Wednesday, so I'll set that up. Does anybody have any questions? We have about 5 minutes left, so does anybody have any questions before we sign off today?
How long is the test open for?
It'll be open
At 11.
from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then you'll have a 90-minute time limit, just like before.
Okay, cool.
So once you start it, you'll have 90 minutes. Other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
This is like the last objective before today's objectives. It was explained how plants benefit from each alternative pathway of photosynthesis. Was that in the slides? I think I might have missed it if that was.
Well, the benefit for the C4 plants is that they are able to concentrate carbon dioxide in their bundle sheath cells so that they're increasing the carbon dioxide to oxygen ratio, so they minimize photorespiration. So they are able to fix carbon even when it's like really warm conditions that would normally cause low CO2. So that's the benefit of the C4, is it allows plants to avoid photorespiration and still keep fixing carbon even when it's hot. And the advantage of CAM is it allows plants to have a really high water use efficiency. So it allows the plants to close their stomata during the day when it's really hot, when they would lose a lot of water, and they can open their stomates at night when they're not going to lose as much water. So that's the advantage of CAM. And then the reason that plants do the cyclic electron flow is because that helps them balance out the ATP and NADPH that they are going to need from the light reactions to the dark reactions. So most plants do a combination of cyclic and non-cyclic and linear electron flow. So good question. Any other questions? Okay, thanks you guys. I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting, and if you have questions, feel free to email them to me, and if you wanna talk about them, then I'll have that review session Wednesday morning. And good luck with your studying, and have a great week. I just realized I forgot to pray with you, but go in peace, serve the Lord, and I'll make the sign of the cross, whatever. So have a good week. And I will see you on Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And I'll post this video after class.
Thank you.
All right.